The egg was the size of a man's fist and the color of old pewter, and it sat in the straw like it had always been there, like the universe had arranged the whole Sussex morning around it. Nora found it at 6:15, still in her rubber boots, hair unbrushed. She almost stepped on it. She crouched, and something in the air made her pull her hand back before she touched it. A faint wrongness, the way a room feels after lightning has passed through it. She stood for a long time with the barn light going gold around her, and the ducks murmuring at her shins, and then she walked back to the house and made coffee and didn't say anything to her husband for 3 full minutes. "There's something in the barn," she said finally. Cal was reading a tractor manual he'd already read twice. He looked up. 11 months on the farm, and he could still read everything in her face like she was an open book. In a language he'd studied since birth. She wasn't scared. She was something else. "To find something," he said. She didn't. She poured him a cup of coffee and handed it to him and put her boots back on. They stood over it together in the straw. And Cal thought at first it was a rock, which made no sense. And then he thought it might be some kind of calcified growth, which also made no sense. And then he looked at Nora and she looked at him and he said, "I'm going to get a Geiger counter from the agricultural office." "You don't have a Geiger counter at the agricultural office." "I'll get one from somewhere." "You don't even know what a Geiger counter sounds like." "I'll figure it out," he said. "I always figure it out." She almost smiled. That was the whole marriage in a sentence. The egg was uranium. Not a little uranium, not some trace isotope buried in the shell like a rumor. Dense, refined, weapons-grade uranium in a biological casing that should have been impossible. The man from the county radiological office turned gray when he read the instrument, and he didn't say anything for almost a minute. And then he said, they should all step back, much further back, and someone should make some calls. The calls took the better part of a day and a half. By the time the trucks arrived on the second morning, Cal and Nora had done what they always did when the world got strange. They worked. They fed the flock. They repaired the paddock fence where a corner post had rotted out. Nora made a pie. Cal replaced the belt on the irrigation pump and only swore at it twice. In the evening they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out over the downs, and Cal said, "They're going to want the bird." "I know. We're not giving them the bird." Nora looked at him. "Why not?" "Because she's ours," he said, which wasn't quite the whole answer, but it was enough. The convoy was 6 vehicles long, and it came up the farm lane at 7 in the morning, with a kind of institutional confidence that Cal recognized from 12 years in the merchant marine. The confidence of people who had never once been told by a fence post or a broken pump or a winter that arrived 3 weeks early. The lead vehicle stopped, and a man got out who looked like he had been manufactured in a government warehouse somewhere specifically for moments like this. Tall, pressed, carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Callan Drake," he said. "Cal," said Cal, "Major Aldrin Fawcett. We're here about the egg." I figured. Behind Fawcett, 24 uniformed figures were already fanning out with instruments. Some Cal recognized, some he didn't. A woman in a different uniform stood by the second vehicle, watching him with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite curiosity. She had a tablet, and she wrote something on it. He had the feeling she'd been writing about him before she arrived. "We'd like to examine the bird," Fawcett said. "You can look at her," said Cal. "You're not taking her." Fawcett's expression didn't change. He was too well trained for that. "Mr. Drake." Cal, what you have on this property is a biological phenomenon with direct implications for global security. The animal in question has laid an egg containing enriched uranium-235 of a purity that—" He stopped. He looked at his clipboard. He looked back at Cal. "That isn't possible, but it happened, which means we need to understand how it happened." "I agree," said Cal. "But you're still not taking her." From inside the house, the smell of Nora's coffee drifted out across the yard, and one of the uniformed figures, a young one, maybe 22, standing at the edge of the paddock, visibly lifted her nose toward it, and then seemed to remember where she was. That was the moment, though Cal couldn't have explained it to anyone. He filed it away. They quarantined the farm that afternoon. Nobody in, nobody out, which suited the farm well enough since the farm had never needed much from outside. The farm in autumn was a closed system. The ducks, the chickens, the kitchen garden, the pie Nora had already made, and the 3/4 of a bottle of brandy in the cabinet above the icebox. A Captain Morrell got assigned to live quarters in what had been the spare room, And she turned out to be the woman with the tablet. She was from somewhere Cal couldn't quite place. Not quite military, not quite civilian, the kind of hybrid the government produced when it needed someone who could read a situation and also read an instrument. "You're the xenobiological consultant," Cal said the first evening, which surprised her. "How did you know?" "Nobody else writes things down constantly and also looks at everything like they're not sure it's real." She sat with that for a moment. "The egg isn't from here," she said, which wasn't something Cal had expected her to say that directly. "I know," said Cal. "You know. A duck can't make uranium," he said. "So either the duck is doing something we can't explain, or something else is using the duck as a medium it can understand. And nothing on Earth uses uranium as a medium it can understand." Morel set her tablet down very carefully. "That's the working theory," she said. "How long have you known?" "Since I watched the duck," said Cal. "She's not different. She doesn't act different. She didn't come from somewhere different. Nora bought her in a lot of 60 at the Steining auction in March. She eats the same grain. She drinks the same water. Whatever is doing this isn't inside her." He paused. "It's pointed at her." Outside, the autumn dark settled over the downs, and the instruments beeped their patient beep. And somewhere in the paddock, the duck in question waddled from water to straw and back again, serene and entirely uninterested in its own impossibility. The second egg came 4 days later. It wasn't uranium this time. It was something else, something the instruments took 40 minutes to start to characterize. And what they found made Fawcett cancel his call to London and remake it to a different number, a longer number, a number that Cal suspected had very few people on its list. The egg contained, inside its biological shell, a lattice structure of unknown material that the on-site physicist described as computational. As in, it appeared to be processing something. As in, it appeared to be waiting. "Waiting for what?" said Nora, the physicist, a small, exhausted woman named Dr. Wren, who had arrived in the second wave of personnel and immediately taken over the dining room table with her equipment, looked up. She seemed to notice for the first time that Nora was in the room. "We don't know," Dr. Wren said. "A signal, maybe. A response to something. Or a threshold. A threshold of what?" "Numbers. A sufficient quantity of." She stopped. She looked at her instruments. "I need to ask you something. In the last 8 days, how many people have touched the eggs? Directly. Skin contact." The list was longer than anyone wanted. 12 personnel. Cal and Nora, the county radiological officer, the man from the agricultural ministry who'd come to inspect the quarantine perimeter, and somehow ended up helping move hay bales. 15 humans in direct contact with the artifact. "Why?" said Cal. Dr. Wren pulled her tablet toward her and typed something. "Because I think the threshold might be biological, cumulative. I think the lattice might be building something, from contact, from proximity." She looked up. "I think it's learning us." Nobody said anything for a moment. The instruments beeped. "Huh," said Nora, and she went to put the kettle on. The thing about being stuck on a farm with 24 government personnel and an alien artifact learning to construct something from human biological data was, Cal found, that the days still had their texture. The pump belt still needed monitoring. The lower paddock gate developed a squeal that needed attention. Dr. Wren discovered she'd never had fresh eggs before. Actual fresh eggs, from birds she'd watched that morning. And she sat in the kitchen at 5:45 a.m., eating scrambled eggs with the expression of someone who had received unexpected news that was entirely welcome. The young soldier, whose name turned out to be Bex, took it upon herself to learn the names of all the ducks and report them at breakfast. Each morning, with the gravity of a field dispatch, Fawcett played chess against himself in the evenings. Life did not stop because the situation was extraordinary. This was a thing Cal had learned in 12 years at sea. The extraordinary and the ordinary had to share the calendar. And usually the ordinary won, because the ordinary had more appointments. On the 8th day, the duck, whose name, per Bex's morning reports, was Sandra, laid a third egg. This one was warm, not from body heat. Warm in a way that registered on instruments. A steady low-frequency emission that Dr. Wren spent hour 2 measuring before she came to find Cal in the paddock, where he was replacing a fence post with Reuben, the neighbor who'd been on the property when the quarantine came down and had simply declined to leave, because his fence bordered theirs and he had opinions about the repair. "I need you to come look at something," Dr. Wren said. She led them to the barn. Not the instrument room Fawcett's people had set up in the equipment shed, but the actual barn, dim and smelling of old straw and lanolin, and the specific warmth of many birds in a closed space. She pointed at the egg in its nest box. "It's broadcasting," she said. "Narrowband, short range. I've had people trying to triangulate the receiver for 6 hours." She paused. "There isn't one. The broadcast is local, omnidirectional. It's not sending anywhere. It's putting something into the air, into this space." "What?" said Cal. "A pattern," she said. "A repeating pattern. I need more time to characterize it, but my initial analysis." She stopped again. She had a habit of stopping before the sentence that mattered, like she was still giving herself permission. "My initial analysis is that it's a greeting." Reuben, who had followed them without being invited, said, "A greeting from who?" "From whatever made it," said Dr. Wren. "I think the eggs have been building toward this. I think the first two were tuning, getting the biology right, getting the signal parameters right. This one is talking." "Talking to us," said Nora, who had also appeared because Nora went where things happened. "Talking at us," Dr. Wren said carefully. "I don't think it's in a format we can parse out yet. But I think if we answer." She looked around the barn. At the instruments. At Fawcett, who had materialized in the doorway and was writing in his own tablet now. At Bex, who was standing near Sandra's pen, unconsciously resting one hand on the fence post, fingers near but not touching the bird. At all the humans who had been in contact with the eggs, all 15 of them, all here now, drawn, without quite knowing it, by the frequency Dr. Wren had been measuring, a frequency that was, she would determine later, precisely matched to the resonant frequency of the human inner ear at moments of alertness and attention. It had called them. "If we answer," Cal said. "Yes," said Dr. Wren. "How?" said Cal. "Do you answer something you can't parse?" Dr. Wren looked at him for a long moment. And then, because she was a scientist, and because scientists are in the business of asking the question before they know the answer, she said, "You start with what you have." What they had was 15 humans, a duck named Sandra, a Hereford bull with no relevant experience, 3/4 of an acre of kitchen garden, and the accumulated residue of 8 days of ordinary life, the tools and the repairs and the meals, and the arguments, and the coffee at 6:15 and the chess games, and Beck's morning duck roll call, and Reuben's opinions about fence posts and Nora's pie. Cal thought about this for less time than it would take to describe. "Put the instruments away," he said. Fawcett looked up. "I'm sorry?" "The instruments. Put them away. Everything you brought in here, the meters, the scanners, the tablets, out, Mr. Drake." "It spent 8 days measuring us," Cal said, "watching how we work and what we do and how we talk to each other. It's not waiting for a signal. It already knows what signal it wants. It's waiting to see if we'll." He looked at Dr. Wren. "Reciprocate," she said quietly. "Right." Fawcett's jaw tightened. This was not in his protocols. None of this was in his protocols, but he looked at Dr. Wren and she gave the smallest nod. And Fawcett had enough experience with scientists to know when a scientist was certain versus when a scientist was guessing. And this was not a guess. The instruments went out. Every screen, every meter, every clipboard. 15 people standing in a barn in the early November dark, and a duck in a nest box and an egg that was warm and broadcasting. Beck started it. Nobody told her to. She just started saying the names, not loudly, the way you'd tell someone something you'd been thinking about for a while. Sandra, Gertrude, Mavis, Dolores, Patricia, Winifred, all 60 ducks, everyone. In order. Someone laughed. Not unkindly, just that release of something that had been held too long. And then Reuben started talking about the fence post, the specific characteristics of the rot. What kind of wood held better in this soil? Information he had clearly been waiting to share since the moment the quarantine began. Dr. Wren, without any instrument in her hands for the first time in 8 days, described in quiet, rapid sentences the crystalline structure of the second egg as she'd first seen it, before she'd known what it was, before she'd known to be careful. Just the pure description of a thing she found beautiful. Fawcett opened his mouth and then closed it and then, haltingly, said that his mother had kept chickens and that the smell of this barn was the most homesick he'd been in years. Cal didn't say anything for a long time. He stood with his hand on the wall of Sandra's pen and he thought about 12 years at sea and 11 months on a farm, and the morning he'd first walked this lane not knowing what he was walking into. He thought about the pump belt, and the fence post, and the tractor manual, and Nora's coffee at 6:15, and the texture of days that went on being days, even when they contained impossible things. "We're not impressive," he said to the egg, or to whoever had made it, or to nobody. "You've had 8 days to look at us and you know that. We fix fences, we make pie. We argue about things that don't matter. We're scared of you, and we don't know what you want, and half the people in this barn right now would prefer to take you apart in a laboratory and figure you out that way. And I understand that impulse, because I felt it too." He paused. "But we're still here. We didn't run. We didn't try to destroy it. We just kept going. That's what we do. It's not impressive, but it's what we have." The egg stopped broadcasting. Not in the way a machine stops. No fade, no wind down. It simply became silent, the way a conversation becomes silent when both parties have heard what they needed. The warmth remained for another 20 minutes and then that faded too. And Sandra, uninterested as always, stepped over the egg and went to get a drink of water, Doctor. Wren stood very still in the middle of the barn for a long time. "Did we pass?" said Bex. "I don't know," Dr. Wren said. "I don't think it was a test." She looked at the empty nest box. "I think it was an introduction." The fourth egg came 3 weeks later, when the quarantine had been partially lifted, and most of the government people had cycled back to their offices in London to write reports that would be classified for 30 years and mostly wrong. It was a normal egg, an ordinary, domestic, entirely explicable egg with a yolk the color of a Sussex afternoon. Sandra laid 4 more that week, all of them normal, and the week after that, and the week after that. The agricultural ministry man who'd stayed on to help with a drainage problem he'd noticed and found he couldn't leave alone said it was a very fine flock. Reuben agreed. Bex requested transfer to the farm's monitoring detail, which was granted after some internal correspondence that Cal never saw but could guess at. Dr. Wren came back in February with different instruments, smaller, quieter, less certain of themselves, and spent 2 weeks in the barn writing things down in a notebook that was not connected to any network, that she kept in her coat pocket, that she would carry for the rest of her life. Nobody came back for Sandra. They had decided, whoever had made the decision, that a duck on a Sussex farm in the early days of winter was doing something more useful than anything a laboratory could do with her, that the message, whatever it had been delivered and received, that the 15 humans in a barn, the major with his clipboard, the soldier with her roll call, the scientist with her beautiful crystalline certainty, the neighbor with his fence post opinions, the woman who made pie, and the man who'd spent 12 years at sea learning that the world will be strange and you will keep going anyway, had answered something in a way that registered, had shown something, without meaning to, that you can only show by living. The pump belt broke again in April. Cal replaced it with a better one, and it held all summer, and in the evenings he and Nora sat on the porch and watched the light change over the downs. And sometimes the ducks came close to the fence, and watched with them, Sandra among them, untroubled, laying ordinary eggs in the ordinary straw, as though she knew something that could not be said and had said it anyway. The instruments that had been left in the barn, 3 of them, that Fawcett's people had missed when they packed up, had all stopped working on the night of the silence. Their internal components rearranged in ways that the engineers who later examined them could not explain and did not publish. In their place, each one had left behind a small mass of unknown crystalline material, warm to the touch, in a lattice structure that Dr. Wren, when she saw the photographs 2 years later in a classified report she was not supposed to have access to, immediately recognized. She wrote one word in her notebook, below all the measurements and the field observations and the breakfast egg notes and the duck names that Bex had recited in order in the dark. She wrote, "Yes," and she closed the notebook, and she put it in her coat pocket, and she went back to work.